The Civic Hall had taken 14 months, 2 contract extensions, and one very unpleasant conversation about the atrium's drainage routing before it became the building standing around Declan Morrow on a Thursday evening. And he was aware of it the way you were aware of things you had fixed and argued about and occasionally lost sleep over. Not proudly, exactly, more the way a physician might feel attending a patient's recovery. The building was fine now. He had made it fine. That was the whole job. The drink in his hand tasted like something that had been derived from fruit through a process that diverged from human fermentation at approximately the 3rd step and had arrived somewhere interesting. The food was good. The atrium's acoustics were, as he had told the project architect 14 months ago they would be if she moved the secondary support columns 18 inches to the east, excellent. She had moved the columns. He had never mentioned it again, because that was also the whole job. He was mid-sentence, explaining to a civic infrastructure official why the ventilation routing in the east wing would have been a maintenance problem in 3 years if they'd gone with the original specification, which was accurate and interesting to him, and apparently also interesting to the infrastructure official, who had the focused attention of someone professionally obligated to care about ventilation routing, when he noticed the silence. Not in his conversation, around his conversation, a pocket of quiet that shouldn't have been there, in the way that a load-bearing gap that shouldn't have been there caught his attention on a site, not by announcing itself, but by being wrong relative to what surrounded it. He finished the sentence he was on, because stopping mid-sentence was rude, and also because he had already processed the anomaly and was giving it 30 seconds to resolve before he responded to it. It did not resolve. It expanded. The quiet moved outward from the pocket around him in the specific organized pattern of a thing spreading through a crowd. Conversations ending, not tapering. The social noise of several hundred beings at a celebration dropping away in a wave that had a clear origin point, and that origin point was, as far as Declan could determine by looking at the direction every head was turning him. He looked back. Several hundred beings were looking at him with expressions that his translation software, which had been calibrated for functional communication and not for subtle emotional reading, was rendering with a range of options. Shock, recognition, awe-adjacent, something requiring cultural context. The last category was the most populated. Declan took a measured sip of the fruit-derived drink. He was 20 years into a career that put him in unusual situations with some regularity, and he had developed the assessment instinct before the reaction instinct as a matter of professional survival. Something had happened. He did not yet have sufficient information to determine what. He would wait for more information. The silence reached the podium. The host, Sale Vorathana, her name had been in the project documentation, senior civic official, the kind of person who controlled rooms the way load-bearing walls controlled buildings. Structurally, without appearing to try, stopped mid-sentence in the way of a person who has excellent situational awareness and has just registered that her room has reorganized around a new center of gravity. She looked at Declan. She looked at him with the specific, composed attention of a woman who has been waiting for something and is now watching it arrive. Into the silence of several hundred witnesses, through the hall whose acoustics he had specifically optimized for exactly this kind of projection, she said, "Why did my daughter give you that title?" Declan looked at her, he looked at the crowd, he looked back at her. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice carried perfectly because of the column placement. "Which title?" The silence, which had already been substantial, deepened. Sale Vorathana came down from the podium with the composed urgency of a woman who had not planned this conversation for this venue, and was conducting it here anyway, because the moment had made the venue irrelevant. The crowd reorganized around her passage with the unconscious deference of people long accustomed to her civic gravity, and she stopped in front of Declan with the specific, contained quality of a person holding several things in careful balance simultaneously. She was tall for a Sylvani, with the secondary ocular markings that indicated high neural processing activity, currently flickering at a rate Declan read as significant without knowing the precise significance. She was looking at him the way he looked at structural drawings he hadn't yet fully understood, with complete attention and the patience to wait for the thing that would make the whole picture cohere. "You used a word," Declan said. "My translator gave me something about a title, but I don't have a referent for it. Can you start there?" Something moved across her expression. Not the something he expected, which would have been impatience or surprise. It was something more specific than either. "What did your translator give you?" "Protector Eternal," he said. "That's accurate," she said. "Do you know what it means?" "I don't," he said. "I've never heard it." She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, the hall full of witnesses was very still in the way of a crowd that has collectively decided not to breathe loudly. "I need to ask you about something that happened 3 months ago," she said. He thought about 3 months ago. 3 months ago, he had been in the middle of the Civic Hall renovation, specifically in the phase where the Kelvar District residential demolition project was running parallel to his primary contract, and his team was providing safety consultation on the demo site 2 streets over, because the demo contractor's certification had a gap that the local authority had flagged, and Declan's company had been asked to cover. 3 months ago, he had had a very full calendar and had also pulled a child out of a collapsing building. "The Kelvar District site," he said. Something shifted in Sale Vorathana's composure, not breaking, not even cracking, but shifting in the way of something that has been held very carefully for a long time and is encountering, for the first time, a surface that doesn't require the holding. "Tell me what happened," she said, "in your own words." He told it the way he would tell it in an incident report, because incident report language was how he processed events that had required emergency response. Clear, sequential, factual, stripped of the texture that didn't bear on the cause and effect chain. The perimeter gap in the demo site safety fencing. The partial collapse triggered by a compromised load-bearing section that the pre-demolition survey had underestimated. The child in the collapse zone, in a position that put the secondary collapse window at 12 seconds from initial structural failure. His assessment of the viable extraction route. The extraction. The handoff to the emergency response team that arrived while he was checking the child for injuries he didn't have the equipment to treat if she had them, which she largely didn't. "Standard emergency response," he said. "My safety certification requires proficiency in collapse extraction. I was the closest qualified person." Sale Vorathana looked at him for a moment after he finished. "The child told me," she said carefully, "that you came into the falling building to reach her, that you were not afraid." "I was afraid," he said. "That's part of the training. The fear tells you the timeline. 12 seconds of productive fear is different from fear that stops you." He paused. "She was 8. 8-year-olds read affect differently." "She was 8, Sale said. "Yes." Something in the way she said it made the next connection arrive before she stated it. He looked at her at the composed urgency, the 3 months of waiting, the specific quality of her attention, and said carefully, "She was yours." "She is mine," Sale said. "Her name is Vale." The hall absorbed this. Declan absorbed this. He thought about the child in the incident report, small, conscious, more angry than frightened once she understood she was being carried out, which he had found reassuring at the time and was now reclassifying in a different context. He thought about the handoff to emergency response. He thought about returning to the site to assess the secondary collapse damage and logging the perimeter gap correction as an immediate safety action, and writing the incident report that evening with the efficient thoroughness of someone who had been doing this for 20 years. There was no identification on her," he said. "I didn't know who she was." "I know," Sale said. "She told me you didn't ask." "The priority in a 12-second window is extraction," he said. "Identity is for afterward." "Yes," Sale said. "I understand that now. I have spent 3 months understanding it." He looked at her steadily. "The title," he said, "Protector Eternal, what does it mean?" She told him. She told it in the careful language of a civic official who had explained her culture's laws to other species before, with the additional register of a mother who was explaining something that intersected her own life in a way that made careful language more necessary, not less. The Vel Sorvan, the formal designation, older than the current civic framework, embedded in the culture's legal architecture at a level that predated the modern authority structures built around it. A child who had been saved from mortal risk by someone acting in deliberate disregard of their own safety could bestow the title on the person who saved them. The title carried legal guardianship weight equivalent to adoptive parenthood. It integrated the holder into the community's noble equivalent tier, with corresponding access to civic resources, social standing, and the formal responsibilities that came with both. It could not be revoked once bestowed. It had been registered in the civic record the afternoon Vale left the medical facility, 3 months ago, while Declan was 2 streets away overseeing the installation of the Civic Hall's eastern wing drainage system. He looked at the hall full of beings looking at him. They all knew, he said. The registration is public record, Sale said. Yes. For 3 months. Yes. And no one, he stopped, started again. Why didn't anyone tell me? Sale's expression moved through something that had a complicated relationship with embarrassment, rerouted through civic dignity, and arrived at honest. Because we assumed you knew, she said. It did not occur to anyone that you had not been informed. The registration is public. The designation is significant. We assumed that a person holding the Vel Sorvan was aware of holding it. Declan turned this over in the methodical way he turned over structural problems. He looked at the crowd, whose collective expression he was now reading differently, not all adjacent at him, exactly, but at the specific situation of a person who had held a title equivalent to nobility for 3 months and spent those 3 months attending morning safety briefings and arguing about ventilation routing. "You've all been watching me go to work," he said. "Yes," said the infrastructure official he'd been talking to from approximately 4 feet away, with the expression of a man who had spent 3 months politely not mentioning the most significant thing he knew. "Every day," Declan said. "Every day," the infrastructure official confirmed. Declan looked at Sale. "What exactly were you all expecting me to do?" "Use it," she said simply. "The resources, the standing. People who receive the Vel Sorvan, it changes their circumstances. It has always changed their circumstances. We were," she considered the word, "waiting to see what you would do with it." "I didn't know I had it," he said. "We know that now," she said. He thought about this. He thought about it in the structured way he thought about problems that had more variables than he'd initially assessed, organizing them in the order of load-bearing importance. Legal guardianship of a child, civic standing he hadn't claimed, resources he hadn't accessed, a community that had been watching him for 3 months with the specific bafflement of people observing behavior they could not categorize. "Vale," he said, "is she?" "She is well," Sale said. "She is at home. She is 8 years old, and it is well past a reasonable hour for 8-year-olds. Something in her voice shifted, not softening exactly, but becoming more specific. "She has asked about you, regularly." "What did you tell her?" "That I was working on it," Sale said. He looked at her. "You've been working on how to tell me for 3 months." "I have been working on how to find you in a context that was appropriate for the conversation," she said, with the precise honesty of a civic official who was being careful with language and was aware that he could tell. "The civic celebration was not what you planned," he said. "Not precisely," she said. "But she registered it publicly," he said. "She knew this would come out." "She is 8, Sale said. Her understanding of the practical timeline of public records disclosure was not fully developed when she made the registration. A pause. "She was also confident, I think, that you would have already found out. Because she thought I knew. Because she decided you were the kind of person who would know the things that mattered," Sale said, and the careful language quality was gone from that sentence entirely. It arrived the way things arrived when they had been true for a while and were being said out loud for the first time. The hall was still quiet. Several hundred beings were still watching. The atrium's acoustics, which he had specifically optimized for exactly this kind of carrying quality, were ensuring that none of this was private, which was, he thought, something he was going to have a lot of feelings about later when he had the time. "I'd like to meet her," he said. "Vale, if that's appropriate." Sale looked at him for a moment with the assessment of a woman who had been building a picture of a man from the outside for 3 months, and was now watching the subject of the picture respond to being seen. "Yes," she said, "I think it is." The civic resource document arrived at 7 the next morning, delivered by Sale's office with the efficient formality of a civic institution that had been waiting 3 months to send it, and was not going to waste another hour. Declan read it over coffee in his contractor's quarters, which were functional and adequately sized, and represented the specific residential philosophy of someone who spent most of his time on site, and regarded quarters primarily as a place to sleep and review documentation. He read the document in the order it was presented, which took 2 hours, and made notes in the margin that were the notes of a structural engineer approaching an unfamiliar system, identifying what was foundational, what was supplementary, what was ceremonially offered versus what had genuine practical weight. The noble equivalent social tier was largely ceremonial in its day-to-day expression, which he noted. The civic resource access was not largely ceremonial, which he also noted. The legal guardianship dimension was the most complex section, and he read it 3 times, making different notes each time. Because the first reading surfaced the scope, and the second reading surfaced the obligations, and the third reading surfaced the thing underneath both of those, which was that a child he had carried out of a building in 12 seconds had decided he was worth keeping, in the formal and permanent way that her culture made available to her. He sat with that for a while. Then he sent a message to Sale's office confirming the meeting. Her home was in the civic district, walking distance from the hall, a building with good bones, and a roofline that he assessed in the professional reflex of someone who assessed rooflines. Sale met him at the entrance with the composed preparation of a woman who had organized herself for a meeting that was also something else, and he met her at the entrance with the practical preparation of a man who had spent the morning reading documentation and had a specific question about the guardianship obligations before they went any further. "The Vel Sorvan creates legal co-guardianship," he said. "What does co-guardianship mean in practice? Daily, calendrically, what are the contact expectations?" She looked at him. "That's the first thing you want to know." "The document was detailed about what I'm entitled to access," he said. "It was less detailed about what I'm obligated to do. I'd rather understand the obligations first." Something moved in her expression, specific and brief and not entirely managed. "The obligations," she said carefully, "are defined by the relationship. The law creates the legal framework. What exists inside the framework is built by the people in it. So it's discretionary. Within the legal minimum, yes." "What's the legal minimum?" "Formal acknowledgement of the designation," she said. "Registration of contact information with the civic record. Availability in the case of a guardianship emergency." She paused. "Everything beyond that is constructed," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He had the structural picture now, the load-bearing minimums, and the space the building could occupy above them. "All right," he said. "Can I meet her?" Vale came from the interior of the house with the directional confidence of a child who had heard him arrive, and had been waiting for a reasonable interval before appearing, which was approximately 30 seconds. She was small. He had known she was small. He had carried her, but small registered differently when she was standing in front of him in her home and looking up at him with her mother's precise eyes and an expression that had absolutely no uncertainty in it. "You're taller than I remembered," she said. "You were mostly looking at the ceiling," he said. She considered this. "That's true. I was checking if it was going to fall on us." "Good instinct," he said. "It wasn't." You knew that already, she said. I assessed the secondary collapse vectors before I came in, he said. The ceiling was the least concerning element. She looked at him with the focused attention of a child who has had a hypothesis confirmed. Mom said you were an engineer. Construction, structural primarily. So you knew the building, she said, when you came in. I knew the demo site's structural report. I'd reviewed it the week before for the safety consultation. You knew where it was safe to go. And how long it would stay safe, he said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, processing this in the way of a child who was doing something more than absorbing information, reorganizing it into a picture that had been missing pieces. I told Mom you weren't afraid, she said. You told your mom I wasn't afraid. You didn't look afraid. I was afraid, he said. I'm always afraid when a structure is coming down. The fear tells me the timeline. He paused because she was 8 and deserved the honest version, not the managed one. 12 seconds of fear is different from fear that stops you. She looked at him for a long, specific moment. I know, she said. I was afraid too. That was also good instinct, he said. Something in her face settled, the particular settling of a child who has been trying to locate someone in a story they've been telling for 3 months and has found the fit. She looked at her mother, standing in the entrance behind Declan with the expression of a woman watching something she had constructed in her mind from the outside and was now seeing from the inside. And whatever passed between them in that look was brief and private, and had clearly been developing for 3 months. You can come in, Vale said to Declan. I have something I want to show you. He came in. The something was in the main room, a structure approximately 40 centimeters tall, built from material he identified in the first 3 seconds as construction debris. Composite fragments, connector pieces, the specific grade of bonding material used in civic-grade finishing work. It was assembled with an organizational logic that he followed for a moment in silence, tracing the load path, finding the keystone, understanding what was holding what. It was a small-scale load-bearing arch, structurally sound, built by a child from materials she had apparently collected from the renovation site, without instruction, because she had been watching the construction process and had absorbed something from watching it that had found its way into her hands. He looked at it for a long time. The bonding at the base joint, he said. The left side. You've got more material than you need there. It's not wrong, but it's compensating for something. What was the problem? Vale came to stand beside him and looked at the joint with the focus of someone who had known there was a problem and had not been able to name it. It kept shifting, she said. The base piece is slightly uneven, he said. See the grade here. The material was probably from the floor finishing, which has a built-in drainage slope. It's not flat. I didn't know that. The solution isn't more bonding at the joint, he said. It's leveling the base, even by 2 millimeters. Then the arch distributes the load evenly, and you don't need the compensation. She looked at the arch, she looked at him. Can you show me? Yes, he said. Behind them, in the entrance to the main room, Sale Vorathana was standing with the expression of a woman who had spent 3 months constructing an understanding of a man from incident reports and civic records, and her daughter's descriptions of a 12-second window, and was now watching him crouch down beside her child and explain load distribution in the specific language of someone who had found a kindred mind, and did not yet fully know what to do with the finding. She had not known what to do with it either. She was learning. He claimed 2 things from the Vel Sorvan resource package. The first was a materials access provision, which he used to correct a structural issue in the Civic Hall's eastern wing that had been outside his original contract scope. A hairline stress fracture in the secondary support that he had identified during the renovation and flagged in his final report as a monitoring recommendation, and that the post-project survey had confirmed was developing faster than the conservative estimate. The civic resource access meant he could address it without a new contract negotiation, which saved 6 weeks of administrative process and the structural integrity of a building He had spent 14 months making sound. He filed the materials request, did the work, and documented it with the same efficiency he documented everything. The infrastructure official, reviewing the access record, sent him a message that read, "Of everything available to you, you spent the materials provision on the Eastern Wing support." It was not a question. It was a civic official encountering information he was still categorizing. Declan replied. The fracture was going to be a problem. The resource access was available. It was the most useful thing to do with it. The infrastructure official did not respond immediately. When he did, the message read, "I'm beginning to understand why my daughter gave you that designation," which was grammatically structured as a civic communication and contained something that was not. The second thing he claimed was the standing dinner invitation from Sale's household, which was listed in the resource package under social integration provisions in the language of civic formality, and which he had recognized, underneath the formal language, for what it actually was. He had not declined it the first time it was offered. He had also not declined it the second, third, or fourth time, which was, in the accounting of a man who tracked structural changes by pattern rather than individual occurrence, data. The dinners were on Thursdays. Vale had opinions about the food, which she delivered with the precision of a child who had inherited her mother's exactness and none of her mother's restraint. Declan had opinions about structural problems, which he delivered in the same register. And Vale had developed the habit of bringing construction-related questions to the table in a way that had started as directed at him and had gradually become directed at both of them, which was a structural shift that none of the three people in the room addressed directly because they were all, in their different ways, the kind of people who tracked changes by pattern. On a Thursday 6 weeks after the Civic Hall celebration, Sale and Declan were in the kitchen while Vale demonstrated, in the main room, a revised version of the load-bearing arch, the base leveled, the compensation bonding removed, the arch standing with the clean logic of something that had been understood and then built correctly. Sale was making something that smelled excellent. Declan was reviewing a structural timeline on his tablet, which he had brought because reviewing structural timelines was what he did in the evenings, and which he was not reviewing with his full attention because his full attention was not entirely on the tablet. "She's going to want to build something larger," Sale said. She was not looking at him. She was doing something precise with an ingredient that required precision. "The arch principles scale cleanly up to about 3 meters with the materials she's been working with," he said. "After that you need to start thinking about foundation load. Will you teach her?" He looked up from the tablet. She was still doing the precise thing with the ingredient, which meant she had asked the question without staging its delivery, which he had learned, over 6 Thursdays, was how she asked the questions that mattered. "Yes," he said. She looked at him then. Briefly. The secondary ocular markings were at the particular rate he had learned meant something he was still building the vocabulary for, but whose general register he had been able to read for 3 Thursdays now. "Good," she said. She returned to the ingredient. He returned to the timeline. He was not technically reviewing it. From the main room, Vale said, "It's standing, come look." They went to look. The arch was standing, clean and correct, and built by an 8-year-old who had understood something about load and balance from watching a renovation she had wandered too close to, and who had found in the correction of a too heavy joint the thing that all structural work resolved into when you did it right. The clean line of a thing holding exactly what it was built to hold, and nothing more. Declan looked at it. He looked at Vale, who was looking at him with her mother's precise eyes and the specific satisfaction of a child who has done something correctly and knows it. He looked at Sale, standing beside him in the main room of her home on a Thursday evening, in the amber light that Solon Station produced at this hour, 6 weeks into a standing invitation he had not declined. He had been given a title he didn't know he had. He had not claimed the social standing. He had not leveraged the resource access beyond the fracture repair. He had claimed a materials provision and a Thursday dinner, and a child who had decided, in a 12-second window 3 months ago, that he was worth keeping. He thought about the question the hall had asked. He thought about why someone would continue conducting themselves as an ordinary contractor when they'd been granted something that elevated them to something else. The answer was not that he hadn't known. The answer was that knowing didn't change what was worth doing. He looked at the arch. "The keystone is slightly off-center," he said to Vale, "by about 3 millimeters to the right. The arch is compensating for it, which is why it's holding. But if you center it exactly, the load distributes equally on both sides and the structure is more stable." Vale looked at the keystone. She looked at him. "Show me," she said. He showed her. Sale watched them both in the amber evening light of her main room with the expression of a woman who had spent 3 months working on something and had arrived, without quite identifying the arrival point, at the thing she had been working toward. The arch